Mariticide is defined as the act of killing one's husband or boyfriend. The terminology is gender neutral and can be applied to same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relationships. Some women marry and murder many different times to collect life insurance policies or for other financial gains. Some women simply enjoy the thrill of the kill. Here are 5 disturbing cases of mariticide. Number 5. Evelyn Dick was a beautiful young woman in the town of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. She was a troubled young woman, and growing up in the 1920s and 30s wasn't easy, and for Evelyn, she had to contend with hectic home life too. Her father was an alcoholic, and her mother was cruel towards the whole family, causing frequent, violent arguments to erupt from the 214 Rosslyn Avenue home. Despite the strained relationships, Evelyn lived comfortably and never went without anything. Her parents considered her too precious to mix with the local children, and soon they became envious of her, taunting her for her expensive jewelry and clothes. Since she wasn't allowed to hang around with people her age, Evelyn occupied her time with the company of older men and would often go to racetracks and days out with them. By all accounts, Evelyn was a prim and proper woman. In June of 1945, she met her soon-to-be husband, John Dick. Everyone was very surprised that Evelyn was settling down, especially with the man that they knew so little about. Nevertheless, her family was thrilled, and soon the pair got married. Life for the married couple carried on as normal until Saturday, March 16, 1946. That's when 5 boys found the torso of John Dick in a wooded area in Hamilton. His head, arms, and legs were all missing, and identification was provided by John Dick's brother-in-law. Evelyn became the prime suspect. When a husband is killed, the first suspect is always the spouse. When taken to the police station, she said, "Don't look at me, I don't know anything about it." She made up a convoluted story about how an Italian hitman turned up at their apartment looking for John and wanted to quote-unquote fix him. After he'd been killed, the hitman returned and asked Evelyn to drive both him and the body of her husband to a rural area. Evelyn changed her story again, and this time it involved a man named Bill, who'd been hired on behalf of the Italian killers to take care of John, as he'd been having an affair with another man's wife and had gotten her pregnant. While she was denying all charges of murder against her, the evidence found in her apartment said otherwise. Blood splatter matching the blood type of John was found along with bullets and blood-stained shoes. For her involvement in the murder of her husband, John Dick was sentenced to hanging. Evelyn Dick was sentenced to hanging. Upon appeal, she was granted clemency and instead sentenced to serve time in prison. She was paroled in 1958 and became known as the Torso Killer, but her current whereabouts or previous whereabouts are unknown. Number 4. Catherine Knight is the first Australian woman to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and for a good reason. Her crime was extremely brutal, and many of the details are too graphic for us to cover here. Like many women in this list, Catherine didn't have a great start in life. Her family were known in Aberdeen, New South Wales as being a rowdy and rough bunch. Her father was an alcoholic who would abuse her mother, making a very unhappy home environment. Her mother would then tell Catherine how much she hated men and how disgusting they all were, enforcing the hatred of men in young Catherine's mind. Much like her father, Catherine had a wicked temper, and she would turn off and on at the flick of a switch. She was described as a bully and would use her large stature to intimidate and harass younger children. She once even pulled a weapon on a classmate. When she was just 16 years old, she got her dream job. It wasn't working at a clothes store or working in the beauty industry. Catherine was thrilled because she'd bagged herself a job at the local abattoir. Catherine had a string of relationships, all of which were toxic and turbulent. She would frequently become violent towards her lovers and even fractured her husband's skull after she hit him on the back of the head with a frying pan. Luckily, he escaped with his life, but others wouldn't be so lucky. John Price had the misfortune of meeting Catherine in 1988 after his previous marriage had broken down after the two had an affair. The pair moved in together in 1995, and at first the relationship seemed perfect. Soon the violent arguments began, and Catherine was infuriated that John refused to marry her and even sabotaged his job by telling his boss that he'd stolen out-of-date first aid kits. This was the last straw for John, and he quickly kicked Catherine out of the house. It seemed that John couldn't resist Catherine's charm, and the pair quickly restarted their relationship again soon after. Most of his friends disowned him as they hated Catherine so much and refused to have anything to do with the couple. February 29, 2000 would be the last time John Price would be seen alive. He even told his colleagues, "If I don't come into work the next day, it's because Catherine has murdered me." The next morning, when John didn't turn up for work, police were alerted, and by 8 a.m. the horrific scene was discovered. John Price was found dead in the house with 37 stab wounds from a butcher's knife. Catherine also cut up his body and served it to dinner to John's children. For the brutal murder of John Price, Catherine Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During her trial proceedings, it was found that Catherine was suffering from borderline personality disorder and had dissociated on the night of John's murder. Number 3. Stacey Castor and Michael Wallace seemed like the perfect high school sweetheart couple. Shortly after they met in 1985, the pair became inseparable. The pair were soon married and had 2 daughters, living the picture-perfect life in upstate New York. The marriage soon soared when the couple grew apart and had differences when it came to parenting. Stacey was jealous that her husband seemed to be closer to their youngest daughter, so in turn, she made her best efforts to become best friends with their oldest. Stacey Castor would become implicated in not 1 but 2 murders. Her first husband, Michael, fell ill in 1999 and soon passed away in 2000 from a heart attack. Friends and loved ones were concerned about the sudden onset of Michael's illness, but as his death had been ruled a heart attack, there wasn't much they could do apart from keeping a close eye on Stacey. After mourning the loss of the man she considered to be her true love, Stacey gave love another shot, and in 2003, she married a businessman named David Castor. David owned his own company, and Stacey acted as an office manager. She loved the feeling of finally being successful and living the luxurious lifestyle that wasn't possible with Michael. For 2 years, everything seemed great. Her 2 daughters did have trouble bonding with their stepdad and were still coming to terms with the death of their father, but nevertheless, they made it work and the family life continued. That was until August of 2005, when Stacey frantically called police after her husband had not shown up for work. She told police that the couple had been arguing the previous weekend, and in the call, she's heard telling officers my husband locked himself in our bedroom for the last day, and that she was concerned for his well-being. When he was unresponsive to the police at his door, the officers kicked down the bedroom door and found David naked on his bed. On his bedside table was a glass of cranberry juice, brandy, and on the floor was a bottle of antifreeze that had been poured into the glass. Initially, the tragic death was ruled a suicide, with the coroner commenting that David had drunk antifreeze in a bid to take his own life. That was until the evidence analysis came back and showed Stacey's fingerprints were all over the glass filled with antifreeze. It appeared that Stacey had slowly poisoned her husband with antifreeze until he was dead. Police were now also suspicious about the death of Stacey's first husband and ordered that his body be exhumed for further testing. To no one's surprise, a toxicology exam revealed that Michael had died from antifreeze poisoning. Investigators worked tirelessly, and although it took them 2 years, they finally gathered enough evidence to convict Stacey Castor of the murder of David Castor. If the murder of the 2 husbands wasn't enough, Stacey had also tried to murder their eldest daughter to make it appear that she was the one responsible for their demise, but thankfully, police caught her just in time. For the attempted murder of the elder daughter, Stacey was sentenced to 25 years, and for the murder of her husband David, she was given 25 years. She was never given a sentence in relation to the murder of her first husband. On June 11, 2016, Stacey Castor was found dead in her cell. Her death was officially listed as undetermined. With the death of Stacey, it seems there's no one left to face justice for what she did to those 2 innocent men. Number 2. Betty Lou Beets was born in Roxborough, North Carolina on March 12, 1937. For the US, the 1930s were a time of hardship. They just experienced a huge market crash, and once again it seemed the world was amping up towards another war. Betty had a very tough childhood. She grew up in poverty and was frequently abused by her parents. At the tender age of 3, she caught measles, which affected both her hearing and speech. Due to her family being so poor, she never received hearing aids or any other physical therapy. From a young age, Betty was angry at the world. She married her first husband when she was just 15 years old, and the pair had a total of 6 children together, but that's not to say that the marriage was a happy one. Betty would later tell the court that Robert was abusive, and when he finally left her in 1969, she was crushed both emotionally and financially. Betty went on to have a string of marriages, ones that were no happier than the last. She even shot one of her husbands, but charges were dropped as it was found to be in self-defense. She admitted that she didn't like to be single, even if it meant getting with men who were no good for her. Husband number 6 would bear the brunt of Betty's rage that she'd built up over her life. In 1982, she married Dallas fireman Jimmy Don Beats. Again, this marriage was nothing special, and soon the arguments and violence set in. Jimmy barely lasted a year before Betty shot him and buried him under a wishing well, which she had purposely built to hide his body. She called in the help of her son from her first marriage, Robert Franklin Benson II, and her daughter, Shirley Stegner. Together, they hid his body under the well and promised to take the secret to their grave, or at least Betty thought they would. Fast forward to 2 years later, and Betty was arrested on June 8, 1985 for the murder of Jimmy Don Beats. While it isn't known exactly who came forward, we know that someone close to her told the police everything. Armed with a search warrant, they found the body of Jimmy Don Beats and Doyle Barker, her 5th husband who disappeared in 1981. Betty's motivation for the murder of her 2 husbands in cold blood was money. She was set to gain a trailer from Barker and life insurance and pension money from Beats. If she had divorced either of these men, she would have walked away with nothing. While she was never charged for the murder of Doyle Barker, she was charged with the murder of her 6th husband, Jimmy Don Beats, to which she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Despite numerous pleas and appeals, Betty was not given a stay of execution. On February 24, 2000, she was put to death by lethal injection at the Huntsville, Texas prison. Number 1. Kelly Gissendaner would shock the world and become the only woman on Georgia's death row after courts found her guilty of the brutal murder of her husband, Doug, in 1996. Doug was described as a respectful and honest man. While he didn't do too well in school due to his dyslexia, Doug proved to be great at more physical jobs where he could work with his hands and apply himself. The pair met in 1989 and instantly hit it off. The relationship moved quickly, and by September of 1990, the two were married. The marriage quickly fell apart and the true side of Kelly began to come out. She would scream and shout at Doug while he stood there in shock, not knowing what to do. He'd been raised in a calm and quiet household and wasn't used to arguments. Following a stint away in the army, Doug returned to the US and decided that a miserable marriage and a miserable life just wasn't for him, and the two finalized their divorce in May of 1993. It seems that something in the universe wanted the couple to be back together, because by 1994, the pair had reignited their relationship after realizing they both loved each other dearly. Over the next 2 years, the marriage would bounce back and forth. The pair would separate, with Kelly running into the arms of Greg Owen. Again, it didn't take long for the pair to give their marriage one last shot by 1996, when Doug decided that it was time for one last try. On February 9th, 1997, Doug was reported missing by his wife, Kelly. According to Kelly, she'd been out with a few girlfriends, but left early after she felt that something bad was going to happen. She arrived home to an empty house, but wasn't surprised, as Doug said he would be busy that evening on something for the local church. When she woke up the next morning, her husband Doug still wasn't home, and she had a bad feeling about it. It wasn't until 12 days later that Doug's body was discovered on a dirt road not far from the home he'd shared with his wife and children. Doug had been stabbed multiple times in the neck, head, and shoulder. Police wasted no time in swooping in on Kelly and her lover, Greg Owen. The pair were charged with the murder of Doug, and Greg struck up a plea deal with Georgia authorities. In exchange for his testimony, he would be protected from the death penalty. Greg testified that Kelly had asked him to help her kill her husband, and explained that she would gain $20,000 in life insurance policies and $84,000 from the home that they shared. When Doug returned home that evening, he was ambushed by Greg, who forced him into his car and drove him to a secluded location. Once there, he was beaten and stabbed numerous times and left to die in the road. Kelly then met up with Greg at the scene to ensure that her husband was dead and get rid of as much evidence as possible before setting her husband's car on fire. Once the jury had heard everything, it didn't take long for them to find Kelly guilty of the brutal assault and murder of her husband. It was a huge risk for the prosecution to seek the death penalty, but it paid off. On September 29, 2015, Kelly was put to death by lethal injection. Instead of last words, she chose to sing Amazing Grace until she lost consciousness. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.